May 1945. Hollywood director George Stevens and a few of his camera team are making fun of the Nazis. Adolf Hitler is dead and the Wehrmacht has finally been defeated. A bit of tomfoolery, perhaps to blot out memories of the horrors of Dachau.
Stevens is in no hurry to return to Hollywood. He is determined to document the end of the Nazi regime as accurately as possible. Consequently, he and his team have also come to Berchtesgaden. Stevens has been given permission to film on the Obersalzberg, Hitler's private refuge high above the town. The Berghof is a ruin, a symbol of the demise of a murderous ideology.
From the Obersalzberg, Stevens travelled to nearby Austria, first to Salzburg and then on to Innsbruck, sightseeing in a country which had willingly thrown itself into the arms of the Nazis. The small camera team also drove to the Brenner Pass, on the border with Italy and South Tyrol. The Wehrmacht had laid down its arms in Italy and southern Germany, but not in Austria as a whole, and the Reich government in Flensburg in northern Germany was still refusing to capitulate to the Soviet Union.
May the 6th, 1945. On behalf of Admiral Dönitz, Colonel General Alfred Jodl had flown to Reims in France to sign the declaration of the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. Kirke B. Lawton, Eisenhower's man for photojournalism in World War II, documented this major event in world history with his amateur camera. Jodl still had hopes of securing a separate armistice with the Western Allies. Negotiations in the Allied headquarters were deadlocked for hours. Headed by General Eisenhower, the Allied delegation resolutely demanded the unconditional surrender of the German armed forces on all fronts. Jodl hesitated because this was a step he had no authority to take. The British and Americans responded by threatening to start bombing German cities again. To avoid annoying Stalin, a high-ranking Soviet liaison officer had been invited to attend the ceremony. It was only after midnight that the German delegation received a telegram from Dönitz saying that Jodl was allowed to sign.
At 2:39 a.m. on May the 7th, 1945, US General Walter Bedell Smith, Soviet General Ivan Suslaparov, and, as a witness, French Major General François Sévé all signed the capitulation document. Then it was Alfred Jodl's turn to add his signature. Then the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight D. Eisenhower, announced that as of 23:01 hours, Central European time, on May the 8th, 1945, the war would be over.
We, the undersigned, acting by authority of the German High Command, hereby surrender unconditionally to the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command, all forces on land, sea, and in the air who are at this date under German control.
When Josef Stalin heard of the capitulation in Reims, he was beside himself with rage and demanded that the ceremony be repeated in his own sphere of influence. But the news from Reims had already been made public. As a result, most German soldiers surrendered voluntarily, if possible to the Americans. On May the 7th, a cameraman with Special Film Project 186 took these pictures somewhere in southeast Germany. In Tyrol on the evening of May the 7th, author Erich Kästner wrote in his diary,
Flensburg radio station has announced that Jodl has signed the capitulation document and that it will come into force tomorrow. But the radio station in Bohemia has called the report a fabrication concocted by the enemy. In Berlin, the Russians claim to have found the corpses of Goebbels, his wife, and their children. Now the radio stations have ceased broadcasting. It is quiet here. The only sound is that of cockchafers, those little armored insects flying headfirst into the illuminated window.
Meanwhile, Czech resistance fighters had restored the old borders which the Munich Agreement of 1938 had shifted in favor of the Sudeten German minority. Over the past 2 weeks, US General George S. Patton had advanced 30 to 40 kilometers a day, an almost incredible rate of progress. In early May 1945, his troops had crossed the border into Bohemia. On May the 6th, American units liberated the city of Pilsen. The next day, the GI's arrival turned into a rousing victory parade. Thousands of Pilsen citizens welcomed the Americans with boundless joy. It was the first time cameramen with Special Film Project 186 had been able to film scenes of jubilation.
Gone were people's fears that their hometown could still be turned into a battlefield. Yet that nearly happened, because in Pilsen and the surrounding area, the Germans still had around 15,000 troops who were determined to crush any attempts by the Czechs to revolt. However, the 2 US divisions which liberated Pilsen outnumbered the Germans. So the German commander, General von Majewski, decided to surrender. At 2:15 on the afternoon of May the 6th, 1945, he signed the capitulation document and ordered his troops to cease all hostilities. Then, in front of his staff and his wife, Majewski committed suicide. The American liberators remained in Pilsen for 7 months.
The occupying Germans left Pilsen forever. 6 years of brutal suppression had left their mark. In March 1939, Hitler's Wehrmacht had broken the Munich Agreement and marched into Czechoslovakia. As part of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, for years the people of Pilsen, too, were at the mercy of German despotism and terror. Around 3,000 Jewish citizens were deported to concentration camps.
Right up until Germany's capitulation, Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner and his troops were entrenched in Bohemia. Schörner was a fanatical Nazi whom Hitler, in his last will and testament, had appointed commander-in-chief of the army. In line with the maxim, strength through fear, Schörner used brutal methods to put his troops under pressure. Deserters were hanged from the nearest tree with a sign round their necks saying, "I refuse to protect German women and children."
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels commented on this attitude as late as March 1945.
Such methods have an impact, of course. At any rate, every soldier in Schörner's combat area knows that he can die at the front and will die at the rear.
The German prisoners of war were escorted out of town by Czech resistance fighters. Things weren't always as amicable as these pictures taken by a US Air Force cameraman suggest. In places where, prior to the arrival of the Allies, a vacuum had formed, excessive violence was common. The aggressive mood was fueled by the Czech president in exile, Edvard Beneš, who, even before the war was over, had said,
"The Germans will be paid back many times over, and without mercy, for all the crimes they have committed in our land since 1938.
The Americans came across the victims of acts of vengeance time and again. It is May the 8th, 1945, the last day of the Second World War in Europe. The Czechs celebrated their American liberators, but they had nothing but contempt for their former tormentors. The bodies were carted away and buried somewhere. No one in Bohemia shed a single tear for a dead German.
The cameraman with Special Film Project 186 took these pictures right on the Soviet-American demarcation line. Before this Wehrmacht officer is allowed to pass the checkpoint, he has to hand over his pistol. A German general surrenders in comfort in a convertible. A US military policeman then drives him to a special prisoner of war camp for high-ranking officers.
Anyone who was fortunate enough grabbed a ride on a Wehrmacht truck heading for the safety of the West. Among the endless convoy of German soldiers, there were also some trucks carrying jubilant Czechs. At 12:30 on May the 8th, 1945, Reich President Karl Dönitz spoke to the nation on the radio.
Men and women of Germany, in my address on May the 1st, in which I informed you of the death of the Führer and my appointment as his successor, I stated that my first task was to save German lives. In order to attain this goal, in the night of the 6th to the 7th of May, I ordered the Armed Forces High Command to declare the unconditional surrender of all fighting troops in all theaters of war. At 2300 hours on May the 8th, the guns will fall silent.
Most of the defeated German soldiers had to make their way into captivity on foot. This is how one soldier remembered May the 8th, 1945.
We were really frightened. All we could think about was what awaited us over the next few days. What would happen to us in Czechoslovakia, surrounded as we were with no way out? Then suddenly the war was over. The new Führer of what was left of the Reich, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, announced the unconditional surrender of the Reich and the Wehrmacht. At long last the war was over. Years of destroying human lives and property were over. But what would become of us Germans now? My life had been preserved, but how would I be able to shape it? Would there be any real possibilities open to me?
On May the 8th, US President Harry S. Truman addressed his nation on the radio.
This is a solemn but a glorious hour. Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band.
The rats were leaving the sinking ship. On May the 8th, 1945, in Kitzingen near Würzburg, a German war hero allowed himself to be filmed by a cameraman with Special Film Project 186. Together with his squadron, fighter and bomber pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel had flown out of Bohemia to surrender to the Americans. Rudel was the only member of the German armed forces to be awarded the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords and diamonds. He was also a fanatical Nazi. In March 1945, while still in a military hospital after being seriously wounded by Soviet anti-aircraft fire, Rudel appeared on Joseph Goebbels' weekly propaganda newsreel, exhorting the Germans to stand firm.
This time it is not about personal sacrifices. We all need to grit our teeth and willingly accept these sacrifices. And in the end, this nation of ours, which up to now has fought so courageously and has indeed gritted its teeth, will achieve final victory.
Rudel presented himself to his American hosts as a cultivated individual who, as a soldier, had merely been doing his duty. Rudel spent nearly a year in American captivity. After he was released, he first set up a haulage company. But in 1948, he fled via the Rat Line to South America. In Argentina, Rudel set up a relief organization for Nazi war criminals and maintained close contact with fascists from Italy and Croatia who were being searched for worldwide. Rudel ended the war as an amputee, but still firmly convinced that National Socialism had been a good idea.
In this respect, he was totally in agreement with Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, who, like Rudel, was a highly decorated fighter pilot. After his release from American captivity, Galland also went to Argentina, where he acted as advisor to President Juan Perón's Air Force. When Perón was ousted from power, Adolf Galland returned to Germany, while Hans-Ulrich Rudel served the dictators of Paraguay and Chile. In Chile, he occasionally resided in the notorious Colonia Dignidad torture commune. For the rest of his life, Rudel maintained close contact with the neo-Nazi scene in Germany. The funeral of the Nazi war hero in 1982 turned into a macabre showpiece. Old comrades bade farewell with the Hitler salute. German Air Force jets made a low-level pass over the cemetery, and the mourners sang all three verses of the German national anthem.
In London on May the 8th, people gathered in the streets to celebrate the end of the Second World War in Europe. In his memoirs, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote,